Welcome to the critique. Today we are reviewing a report analyzing Elon Musk's strategic relocation of Tesla, SpaceX, and X to Texas, framing it as an attempt to build a self-contained civilization amidst economic booms and environmental controversies. Let's dive right into the feedback.
Yeah, let's get into it.
The comparison between Musk's housing plans and 19th century company towns is a compelling hook, but it currently functions more as a label than a tool for deep analysis.
Right, I completely agree with that. The draft mentions that experts are comparing these planned communities to historical company town. But the weakness is that it treats this comparison as entirely self-explanatory.
It just points out the physical similarities.
Exactly. It says, there are houses next to a factory, so it's a company town. And then it just moves on. It completely misses the opportunity to explore the tension that's inherent in this revival.
Because the reader, or the listener in this context, is already an expert. They know the history of company town.
They do. They know about the paternalistic control of the 19th century. But the text doesn't explicitly contrast that history with Musk's very loud libertarian rhetoric.
So the suggestion for improvement here is that the author should use this analogy to expose the irony in Musk's project.
Yes, absolutely. You have to move beyond just the physical comparison of housing next to factories and dive into the philosophical comparison.
How would they practically do that on the page?
Well, for a concrete example, take that quote in the text about California's overregulation. Musk complains about it, but contrast that with the reality of a company town. Historically, a company town is the ultimate form of regulation over a worker's life.
Your boss is your landlord.
Your boss is your landlord, your grocer, your mayor. So instead of just saying experts compare it, the author should analyze specific parallels to places like Pullman, Illinois, or Fordlandia.
Right, bring in the historical specifics to anchor the point.
Yeah, and ask if Musk's version offers a modern twist. Like, is it relying on digital surveillance? Or maybe equity-based control, rather than just physical proximity to the factory?
That makes it a much sharper critique. It forces the writer to ask, is he building a town to liberate his workers from commuting? Or is he actually building it to bypass municipal governance entirely?
Precisely. Make the text do the work.
Let's move to the next major point. The central thesis that Musk is building a civilization is provocative, yet the material currently defines this civilization almost exclusively through physical infrastructure.
This was a huge missed opportunity. The weakness here is that the text cites an anonymous source saying Musk is building a civilization, and then it supports that claim with examples of factories like Giga Texas, launch sites at Boca Chica, and boring.
It's just a list of concrete and steel.
Right. But a civilization is defined by its social contract. It's defined by its laws, its culture, its art, not just road. By focusing almost entirely on the construction speed and the sheer scale of it all, the piece really misses the human and political dimensions of this new society.
So the suggestion here is for the author to define the ethos of the civilization.
Exact. The draft quotes Governor Abbott talking about economic freedom in tech. So how does that abstract concept of economic freedom translate into the actual daily life of this new civilization?
What's a concrete example the writer could use to show that?
Look at the text's mention of decision-making happening on a scale unknown in the public sector. The writer needs to frame this not just as a marvel of corporate efficiency, but potentially as a massive shift from democratic process to autocracy.
Because unknown in the public sector usually means zero public oversight.
Yeah, and another example is the infrastructure lag they meant. The draft talks about shortages of roads and water. The author should use that to argue that Musk's civilization prioritizes industrial output over civic necessity.
Which is the exact opposite of traditional municipal planning.
Right. So challenge the word civilization. Make the text fight for that label. Is it an actual civilization, or is it just a massive industrial park with dormitories attached to it?
That framing makes the analysis so much more engaging. It raises the stakes.
It does. It takes it from a real estate report to a sociological critique.
Which leads us right into the environmental section. The conflict between economic development and environmental preservation is currently presented as a standard binary, which flattens the specific stakes of the Texas coast context.
Yeah, this section felt very familiar. The draft relies on a very traditional jobs versus nature framing.
You have Governor Abbott touting the billions in investment on one side.
And then Jim Chapman, the local activist, worrying about the wildlife and shorelines on the other. And while that's accurate to what's happening, the weakness is that this approach feels generic. It doesn't capture the specific irreversibility of the changes being described.
It reads like any other story about a new factory being built.
Exactly. The suggestion for improvement is to shift the lens from just environmental damage to fundamental transformation. It's not simply that some wildlife is being disturbed. It's that the topography itself is being completely re-engineered.
So how do we give the writer a concrete way to pivot that framing?
Focus on the quote in the draft about the area changing from a natural surface to heavy industrial activity. The author should frame this as a permanent loss of the public commons for private gain. It's not just an environmental compliance issue about filling out the right forms.
It's about who owns the land and what it's used for permanently.
Right. And you can connect that environmental critique directly back to that freedom argument we talked about earlier.
Because Musk's freedom to build heavily impinges on the local community's freedom to actually access their own coast.
Exactly. So instead of just quoting the environmentalist in isolation talking about birds, put his concerns in direct dialogue with the future Musk claims he's building. Ask the question on the page, is the future habitable?
That elevates the conflict. It's not just a side note about biology, it's central to the whole thesis.
It makes the environment the actual stage where this power struggle is happening.
That brings us to our final major point. The narrative accepts the premise that moving from California to Texas is a move from regulation to freedom without sufficiently scrutinizing what that freedom actually entails.
This is probably the biggest structural flaw in the argument. The text quotes Musk criticizing California for overregulation, over-litigation, and overtaxation.
And it contrasts that with Texas being this beacon of economic freedom.
Right. And it presents this narrative as a successful escape. But the weakness is that it completely fails to ask if Musk is actually escaping regulation or if he's simply moving to a place where he becomes the regulator.
So the suggestion is to look for regulatory capture.
Yeah. The feedback should urge the writer to explore how Musk isn't just finding a free market down there. He is actively shaping the rules of the game in Texas.
What's a good concrete example from the text to highlight this?
Highlight the section where it mentions Musk is reshaping entire counties. I mean, stop and look at that phrase. If one single man can reshape an entire county, is that actually freedom for the residents living there?
Or is it a return to feudalism?
Exactly. The writer needs to analyze the power dynamic. In California, the state clearly held power over Musk. They could tell him no.
But in Texas, does Musk hold power over the state infrastructure?
Given the mention of him essentially controlling water and roads for his projects, yes. The writer also needs to revisit that litigation comment. Musk says he left to avoid litigation.
Which sounds like a standard business complaint.
But is he avoiding litigation because Texas just has fewer laws or because he has massively more leverage there? Litigation is often the only tool citizens have to hold corporations accountable. Avoiding it means avoiding accountability.
So the writer needs to reframe freedom as the transfer of control.
Exactly. From the democratic state to the private corporation.
That is a phenomenal pivot for the piece. Okay, let's wrap this up and recap the main actionable points.
First, sharpen that company-town analogy. You want to contrast the 19th century paternalism with Musk's modern libertarian rhetoric to expose the irony.
Second, expand the definition of civilization. Move beyond the concrete and the factories to include the actual social and political implications of his governance.
Third, get the environmental discussion out of that tired jobs versus nature framing. Shift it to a discussion on the permanent privatization of public resources.
And finally, critically examine that concept of freedom to see if it's really just a transfer of control from the state to the corporation.
We highly encourage you to apply these lenses, refine the argument, and resubmit the work for a follow-up critique.
Thanks for tuning in to The Critique. Get back to writing.